You're listening to Trek FM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we look forward to seeing you there.
This is Steve Sansweet of Rancho Obi-Wan, and you're listening to the 602 Club.
There was a little bar in Mill Valley where all the Starfleet trainees used to go.
The 602 Club.
You know it.
I was there more times than I can remember.
Oh, it's a funny old life, eh? Mm-hmm. Well, you've got your story for your newspaper. All's well that ends well.
It's not ended. Sir Francis left another clue at the bottom of the globe.
Clue to what?
400 weight of gold, just lying at the bottom of the sea. How's your thirst for adventure, Captain?
Unquenchable, Tintin.
Welcome, everyone, to the 602 Club. I'm so excited to be back. It's fantastic to be here in the seat. We're only a few weeks away from, I would say, probably the biggest movie of the year. But I wanted to do something special tonight and visit something that it's been a while since I had seen it. But I've always liked this movie, and I really wanted to talk about it with somebody who has an appreciation not only for the character, but the film and the history of the character even more than I do. And so I'm really glad to have back to the show. It's been a long time, but Nic Anastassiou, how is it going?
It's going good, Matt. Thanks for having me on. It's good to be back, and especially on the 602 Club. I have a very special connection to that one. As you know, that's kind of the show that brought us together and brought me into the network, got you and I to become friends, and then the tons of people that I've become friends with who are part of the network, who are hosts, people on the Babel Conference. So the 602 Club means a lot to me, and coming back for this particular movie we're going to talk about, that makes it an even better reason to come back.
Yeah, I love the idea, like the 602 Club on Star Trek Enterprise is a place where people would get together and meet each other and hang out because it's a bar. And the fact that actually brought us together as friends and introduced us to a lot of other people together is a really fantastic thing. It's one of the things I love so much about the show. I mean, the amount of people that I've met just because of it, and people like you, or I think of like John Mills, or so many of the listeners that I talk to so frequently now, that seem like, just friends that I meet in a digital space. I love the 602 Club being that, and it's a joy to have you back, as we're going to be talking about the Adventures of Tintin, and the first movie that they did in that series. It's still tentative of whether they'll ever do another one.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Absolutely. Fingers crossed. But this is The Adventures of Tintin, The Secret of the Unicorn. But before we dive into that, just want to remind everybody, you can find all the shows we do here on the network on Trek FM over at iTunes at itunes.com/Trek FM. That is a great place to check out everything that we're doing. We have shows coming to you pretty much every single day of the week. And while you're over there, hit the 602 Club up with a star rating and review. I really wanted to say a huge thank you. We got one of the most unique reviews for the show. I love it. It really made my day reading this one. And so I want to say a huge thank you to this reviewer. And the reviewer comes from Gerund08, and they said, Matthew Rushing is basically the opposite taste in movies for me. He prefers things that are obtuse and ambitious over things that move and are fun. But I love getting aggravated while listening to Rushing's deep reads and against the grain criticisms. Good show. They gave us 5 stars, and they said, dig in. I love it. Thank you so much. The fact that, we have different tastes, but you still love listening to the show is exactly why we do the show. That really warmed my heart to hear that you can enjoy listening to somebody who may have a different opinion than you do, and still get a lot out of it. That's fantastic. So
that is one of the biggest compliments you can get, especially in today's world. Someone saying, I disagree and I love you for it.
It's awesome. So thank you so much. Really appreciate that. The fact that you gave us a review, again, it helps other people find the show. So follow their lead. Go over to iTunes, hit us up with a star rating review. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on Twitter at TrekFM, Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find us online at trek.fm, where if you're there, you can check out all the shows that we do. There's a contact section that you can go to, trek.fm/contact. If you choose a show, you can choose the 602 Club, and that can send us an email. I can share the email with whoever was on the show with me that week, and we can reply to you back to any questions you might have. Or, we've gotten some emails recently, people just having questions about things about the show or things they think we should do or that kind of stuff, which is awesome. So keep them coming. And, of course, you can find us on our listeners-only discussion group, and that is on Facebook. Now, if you're on Facebook, type Babel into the search field, and you'll find us because it's called the Babel Conference. And if you're on the website, just click discussion on the menu bar, and that'll bring you right over, and you'll be able to join the group and the conversation. So, Nick, as we talked about, we're going to talk about Tintin, the Adventures of Tintin, the film, but I wanted to ask you first, there's kind of some interesting things, this history of this character, for the character itself. I wanted to talk about it for you and then for the filmmakers, because Peter Jackson and Steven Spielberg both have a different coming to this character from each other, which is, I think, fascinating. But I wanted to ask you just a little bit, just American audiences don't seem to be quite as familiar with the character. It might be somewhere in the back of your mind as something you may have seen, but what is the history just of this character as a comic series?
Oh, huge. Tintin, definitely in Europe and in many, many other countries, in Africa and Asia, is really, honestly, as big as James Bond rolled together with Indiana Jones and Superman. You pretty much you can find. I know there was a time. I don't know if that's still true because I remember reading that years ago. But there was definitely a time not too long ago when Tintin was the most translated graphic series of graphic novels or comic books in the world. If it's not anymore, I'm sure it's still in the top, the top 5 or top 10 list. And you can go on any of the major websites, even eBay, and look at Tintin merchandise, and you'll find T-shirts or books, any kind of articles that have Tintin logos and drawings in Arabic, in Thai, in Japanese. I have a T-shirt that somebody had gotten me, I think in the Netherlands or in Sweden, a Tintin T-shirt. So it's a staple. Definitely, again, very iconic in European pop culture, but it's one of those European exports that has traveled all around the world.
Well, and it's crazy to think that Hergé created Tintin back in 1929, and that's the first time that you saw him in a Belgian newspaper. And the fact that he has lasted this long, I think, is pretty amazing. In a lot of the ways that, like you mentioned, Superman, like we think of it, like 1930s was the creation of Superman. So you have these characters that are so iconic that live in the minds of people who read them, and they continually go back and read. And obviously, we haven't had a new Tintin comic in a very long time because Hergé died back in 1983, unfortunately. So, but I mean, just amazing.
Yeah, and I think one of the really interesting things that Hergé used to do as well, which there's probably other comic book creators who did that, but I have not heard of any other who have done that. He would actually go back, and he wouldn't just publish new Adventures of Tintin. He would go back and redraw and republish the original ones to make them more contemporary to the times as the decades. So
you're saying
advance.
He's the original George Lucas?
Well, there's definitely a lineage there. And it's funny. I mean, and he, a little bit like George, he would be very careful, very faithful to what he had done. So he wouldn't just completely change it. He would just refine it, and this is where we may see some parallels. He would actually fix things that he felt he had done right the first time. He would also, you could say, upgrade it for the progress in publishing and printing. One very simple example: the first few adventures were initially published in black and white, and he went back later and redrew them in color. And again, he would refine his style. He would fix things that he thought he had gotten wrong, because he was a one thing. I mean, Hergé's style has been the subject of books. He was very particular about the realism and accuracy of some of his backgrounds, the scenes and locations he would pick, and that's actually, again, that has become the subject of a lot of analysis and discussion. The fact that he combined a very, not photorealistic but realist style with character design that was very cartoony, and same thing in his choice of colors. Once he started to draw in color, very muted pastel type colors, but at the same time also very simple palette of colors that's very, very stylized. So he would go back and refine that over and over, and there are several first edition Tintins depending on when we're talking about. There's some books which he published first in the 30s and 40s, which he then republished in the 50s and 60s.
It's fascinating to me because looking at this person of immense talent, one of the things that was interesting finding out about him is that he didn't do a ton of traveling himself. But the reason that his books felt so real to people around the world is because he did his research. And so he would pour over research wherever he was going to have Tintin be, so that it would feel authentic to the reader of that area, which I thought was really fascinating. Like he's not just drawing a comic and just having a good time doing it. Like he's paying attention to detail of the places that he is referencing or having Tintin go, which I think is one of the things that helped make him such a popular character all around the world, because when somebody read an adventure where he went somewhere, whether it was in Africa or Russia or any of these places, people felt like he got the details right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was definitely very much into, like you said, doing a ton of research, and that there are textbooks about that showing the references he would take from articles to photographs, measurements, to make sure that he got the flavor of the place, the locations right, names, etc. There's also, you have to to frame things in context and be objective. The one thing you see, especially in the earlier books, he was definitely, I mean, he was a man of his time, and so he was colored. He was, you see the filter, the prism of the culture he lived in, and the way that they saw, especially some of those exotic locations, like Africa and even America. If you read Tintin in America, which is one of the early Tintin adventures, it's very, there's a lot of like really, really big cliches. Even later, once he started to redraw those, I would say personally that I actually admire. I think by then he was already aware that some of these were stereotypes, but in redoing them, he stuck to the original. That was the part of him who was kind of faithful to the source material and said, "Well, this is what I published, and I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to change the story. This is what it was." And you see, but it's actually interesting to see also over the 30, 35 or so years. I think his last book was in 1976, I want to say, or 77, that he published. It's interesting to see actually how progressively you see him really evolving with the culture of the time.
Well, and this is the interesting thing too. So, Tintin had been adapted into feature films and animated features and for television series, but it was something that he wasn't particularly happy with anything else that had really come out. And so Spielberg himself, while on tour for Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, was reading a review in a French magazine about the film, and they keep mentioning Tintin, and he doesn't know what that means. He said, I only speak very little French, and so I keep thinking of maybe it just means it's a great movie or something, but it turns out it's this comic series, and he finds some of the works there by Hergé, kind of falls in love with it. Him and Kathy Kennedy actually schedule a meeting with Hergé in 1983 while filming Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and sadly, Hergé died that week. But his widow gives the rights to Spielberg because Hergé himself thought that Spielberg was the only person who could do Tintin justice, which I think is really fascinating. And, I wanted to ask you, as a huge fan of Tintin, how you feel about that idea, because, Spielberg has brought pretty amazing things to the screen, like Indiana Jones.
I was, my mind was blown when I first heard that story. And it's funny because I actually got the chance to speak with Jason McGatlin, who was one of the producers on the film. Then when Kathy Kennedy took over Lucasfilm, he came to work here, and he's now producing the Star Wars films. And it's in that context that I met him. And it's funny because the first time we met, I asked him if we could chat, if I could schedule some time to talk in his office. And I'm sure he thought I was going to pick his brain or try to about some Star Wars nerd thing. And actually, when we met, I was like, okay, so first of all, right off the bat, I'd like to just say that all I want to do, if you don't mind, is geek out over Tintin. Because I know you produced that movie, and I'm really dying to talk about that with you. And I think he thought that was funny, and that kind of got him into. He's like, then he was really happy to talk about Tintin for a while, and he told me that story. He said, because we talked about Indiana Jones, and he said, the funny thing is, Steven had never heard of Tintin when he made Raiders. And he was actually blown away by the number of people who would tell him, this is the best non-Tintin Tintin movie I've ever seen. And that's what got him to think, okay, now I'm curious, I got to check it out. And then he fell in love with it. So I do think, call it synchronicity. I think that they don't draw from the same well, because Tintin is part of that well. Tintin, if you're going to see anything beyond synchronicity, I think that where you can see that where the parallel comes from is that Tintin evolved over a long period of time, but Tintin originated at that time of these, that last gasp, that age where we are already in the modern age. We have airplanes that can fly around the world. We're starting to think about rockets going to the moon and so on and so forth. But we're living the dusk age of romanticism and exoticism of faraway lands and unknowns and mysterious islands and so on and so forth. And that's kind of the in that twilight, in the intersection of those two worlds, is that sweet spot where anything is possible technologically, but anything is also possible in terms of mystery and adventure. And that gives way to things like, Treasure of the Sierra Madre and all the big adventure serials of the 30s, which inspired George, which then led to Raiders of the Lost Ark and Indiana Jones. But it also, at the time, inspired a contemporary of that time, Hergé, to create a character very much like Indy.
I was just thinking as you were saying that, the idea of that beautiful time period that this series is set in, and Indy is set in, is why I also love, which we talked about it way long time ago, Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow. In that same vein, and in a lot of ways, an even more romanticized version of that time period. which I thought was so cool. And so, yeah, these things just fitting together, and I think it's amazing. And one of the things that I also thought was interesting is that Spielberg wanted to make the film live action, but he also knew that they were never going to be able to have a dog do what Snowy can do. So he contacts Peter Jackson because he loves the work that Weta did with Smeagol on The Lord of the Rings, and asks him if they could see what it would look like to create, this character. And Peter Jackson is a huge fan of Tintin since childhood, which is awesome. And I love that the work that they send Spielberg actually has Peter Jackson himself playing Tintin with the digital Snowy running around him and everything. That is just phenomenal.
Yeah, I remember at the time, I'm pretty sure this is something that I can share. A lot of companies were bidding to try to get work on Tintin. Because there was still the possibility, they were going back and forth, live action or part live action with some CG. And so if it was going to be live action characters with a CG Snowy, there was a possibility for VFX houses to work on it. And I remember at the time, we were sent those clips to do our own Snowy test. And I remember having to bring those plates, those clips online, and I was looking at those haddock tests, and I'm like, that's Peter Jackson, which I thought was awesome.
He looks so good. Like, he could have played him. It would have been awesome.
And that's a total nerd fanboy thing for him to do. This is him saying, "Oh heck yeah, I'm gonna be haddock."
Well, and he even had, the Weta Workshop make him the costume, which is phenomenal. So I love the fact that what you get is these two filmmakers who are coming at this from different angles, but are both very passionate about it in different ways. And what I loved was watching the extras and their passion and their thought process and being fans from different places in their lives actually helped them making the movie, because they collaborated quite heavily together. Even though Spielberg is the director, Jackson is heavily involved as the producer, even being there with Steven as he's directing via conference and everything. So I think that like you were saying, there's a synchronicity, but it almost feels like this just wonderful felicity to have these two titans of fantasy genre films to come together to create something that is kind of the godfather of a lot of the things that we've, grown to love, like Indiana Jones or a Star Wars, or, like all of this kind of comes out of everything that Hergé did starting all the way back in 1929.
Yeah, I think one of the great things about Tintin being so universal, I want to say Tintin is like soccer. Tintin is one of those few things, and there aren't many, that transcend almost all partisan lines. And it doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. It doesn't matter what your religious or political beliefs are. You can sit across the table and bring up Tintin, and the person in front of you is gonna, light up and say, yes, Tintin. I remember Tintin. I love Tintin. And again, it's like soccer. You see, this is one of those few arenas where you can see countries that otherwise will be at war, that will get on the field and enjoy 90 minutes and leave everything else to the side. And so, yeah, I think in the arts, in this field, you get that collaboration you're talking about. You get these two guys who share talent, but who have very different talent, and I'm sure very different outlooks on life and so on and so forth. But then this common denominator creates a universal language for them to be able to collaborate in a great synchronicity.
I wanted to ask you before we kind of moved on. For you, what was your history with Tintin? Because you're originally from France, and so what was your first experience with Tintin, and as a kid, what did you fall in love with?
So I came into it like many kids. I was born in the early '70s. I got hand-me-down books from my sister. Um, it's funny. I knew at the time that they were my sisters. I'm starting to wonder if they belonged to somebody else in the family before, because my sister was born in the '60s, and some of the books I went back on one of my trips home not too long ago, and actually brought them back to the U.S. with me, and some of them are from the late '40s and early '50s.
Oh wow!
I wonder if they might have not belonged to somebody else in the family before they got passed on to her. But anyway, my parents gave me, they were just there because every household, every family had the Tintin books, and as you have kids and another kid, you just kind of pass them around. And so read them from a very young age. And probably because of how young I was, it was an even more impactful window into all these faraway lands for me as a little kid. All of a sudden, you could go anywhere in the world. Tintin goes to Tibet. Tintin goes to Africa. Tintin goes to America. Tintin goes to China. And again, it's all latent as a 5, 6, 7-year-old. You're not aware, but I think what draws you, where he really hit that perfect chord, is you have these really cartoony characters, which as a little kid, obviously are going to draw you in right away. They're funny. They're very animated. Even even though he's got kind of a very geometric, very symmetrical layout in his panels. There's a lot of dynamic, kinetic energy as well. But at the same time, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, you have these very realistic, very accurate scenes, places, settings, which make you believe that you're going there, especially as a little kid. So that was my initial window, and the draw for me. And then of course after that, you kind of the books. It was on the end of the original book's publication, but I think there was like two or three books that I picked up in bookstores as they first came out, the last 2 or 3. And so then you get this thing where you feel like now it's part of, you're not just inheriting that from a sibling or someone in your family, but now it's you're taking ownership of it. And so then you enjoy the fact that it's something that you feel like you own as well.
Yeah, this is something for me, I found because of the film and because of who was involved, with it being Peter Jackson and Steven Spielberg putting this together. And so glad that I did. One of the things I have on my wish list at Amazon, hint, hint, anybody out there, is the book set that they have on Amazon, all of them, because I'd love to have them and I'd love to read them all. Because it's such a part of, comic history now. And it would just be so much fun to go back and read those. I really enjoyed what we got as the story here. And that's one of the interesting things for me, being somebody who doesn't know the books, bringing this story together, it was really interesting because this is actually kind of an amalgamation of a few different Tintin stories all put together to make what they felt like was the best story for the first film that they would do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's something we can talk about more when we get into the specifics of the film. Maybe we can move to that part of the show now. But I think it's something struggling to find the right way to describe it. I think that it's the biggest challenge that the film faces, and I don't want to say it's shortcoming because it's not. They did a great job considering the challenge that it was. But it's the one thing that I don't want to say hurts it, but it's an impossible challenge almost. And they did not only the best, but they went beyond the best that they could do. I think the reason why the movie is the way it is and the mosaic it is of stories, they took 3 books and grafted them into one story, is because I think that was them intelligently realizing that the lack of familiarity with Tintin in the US made it so that they had to not just launch you into Tintin adventure, but roll in a ton of exposition about the world, the main character, and so on. And so then they look for both the best adventurous plural, and the elements from another story that would allow them to do that. And again, they considering how challenging it is, and that most movies that try to do something like that, even just 2 books, usually fail miserably. They did a great job. If I had to ding the movie in some ways, it would be for the places where, and again, it's inevitable. It's not really its own fault, but where you can kind of tell that it stretches a little bit the fabric of the story by how much it squeezes in and kind of stitches together from the others. And if again, they really didn't have a choice, because they had to try to make the movie as ready possible for US audiences as they could. If you're going to go the road not traveled way, I would say, I wish in an ideal world where it had been a universal thing everywhere, they might have been able to kind of jump in a little more, like ironically Spielberg did with Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you've never seen this character before, but you kind of are just catapulted into his world. And it's a combination of how good the story is and relying on conventions for the audience to say, oh, I get it. I know where I am. I know who this guy is. I know what's going on. But yeah, you can definitely see these stitches at every level in terms of the writing and the way the movie is shot and edited. It's especially when of course, the Tintin stories. You can see that they carefully try to select the right pieces.
It's interesting because, for them bringing the story together, for me, as somebody who hasn't read those stories, I did feel more like it had kind of that Indiana Jones vibe, in the sense that they kind of drop you in and, you immediately, the story just begins very quickly, like you're, 30 seconds into the movie,
Mm-hmm.
and the mystery begins.
Mm-hmm.
And they just never really, there's really not a moment for a breath the rest of the movie, which is not a problem whatsoever. I'm not dinging the movie in that way at all. So it to me, it did kind of feel like that they had picked the right books to put together. So that, like you said, it felt like when they stitched it together, it worked pretty well. In the sense that, like, especially if you'd never read the books, and if you'd read them, you'd know where they came from. But it sounds like it didn't feel too jarring for you.
No. I think exactly like you said, if you're going to set yourself those parameters and say, okay, what we have to do is this, then within those parameters, they acquitted themselves of the job, I think, as best as anyone could, and probably better than most other filmmakers would have. The only thing, and I feel this is something that's just me speculating. No one's told me that, but I feel like the only thing that I feel is missing from the film is a cold open. I feel like, especially if I put myself in the shoe of someone who doesn't know Tintin, doesn't know the world or whatever, what I want is the beginning of Raiders. What I want to come in, or the beginning of a James Bond movie. I want to come in and I want to see Tintin on the tail end of one of his previous adventures. I want to see him get that photograph or find that artifact or something, which informs me in the space of 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes about a ton of things, before you then take a break, give me a minute to catch my breath, and then launch into our adventure. And I don't, my speculation would be that Spielberg chose to not do this because otherwise he would have probably gotten a reverse comparison of when he did Raiders, which is everyone saying, oh, well, of course you're going to do that because you're doing Indiana Jones, basically. Which is kind of ironic. And I can see, if that's the case, why he would say, well, crap, that would be the thing to do, but I'm locked. I can't do it. And I think they tried, the way that they again, if I read into this correctly, because that's just my interpretation, I felt like they were trying to do that a little bit. It's kind of a cheat with the opening titles.
Yes,
Because,
I was going to mention that. Absolutely.
Yeah, because the animation in the opening titles actually is a bunch of little vignettes in a very stylized, almost like 1950s, 60s style of snippets of other Tintin adventures. And so if you follow during the credits and you catch on that it's not just kind of something to distract you, it starts to inform you a little bit. So it feels like this is kind of what they were trying to say. Okay, well, we can't really do a cold open, but we'll merge it with the credits.
Yeah, I was really paying attention to the credits as I rewatched the film, and I absolutely kind of adored the way that they're done. They're beautiful credits, but the fact that they were kind of giving you a hint as to what his life is like as a character. And so that as you go into the story, and like I said, kind of 30 seconds in, you're already into this mystery. You have an idea that this is kind of who Tintin is. He's somebody who tries to solve mysteries, and I thought that was really fun. And I think part of the success of weaving it together, they got some really good people to bring things together. I mean, at this point when they're doing this, they asked Stephen Moffat, and he was brought on because the first person they invited to write the film, Edgar Wright, wasn't available because he was doing something else. So he says, you should use Stephen Moffat. And so Stephen Moffat begins the script writing process and then has to leave because he becomes the executive producer of Doctor Who. And so to finish it off, they bring back Wright, who's available at that point, who's working with Joe Cornish, and they finish up the script. And like the people that they had, I think, on there, and I'm specifically thinking about the way Moffat is kind of good with fantastical stories because of his work with Doctor Who. I felt like all three of them did a great job of making the story and then kind of the backstory we get with Haddock and Rackham and all of these people, like that part felt really kind of organic to the story. But I feel like that's because somebody like Stephen Moffat, who is very familiar with doing that on Doctor Who, makes that work so well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, you can see, like I was saying, in the writing, and then you'll see that follow through in the execution of the film. You see a lot of care and a lot of talent, considering also the source material you're dealing with and how dense it is. There's a ton of stuff, tons of details in every Tintin story. So to adapt one and to do it right as a film would be a challenge in itself. To then say, let's do three and let's somehow make them feel like one and still make them feel like a real Hergé Tintin adventure. And on top of that, also make it so that it has the right elements for an origin story so that people who don't know don't feel like they're left out. It's a huge uphill challenge you give yourself at square one. And so, yeah, you really see, I think you cannot accidentally stumble into succeeding at this movie. You have to do it deliberately and really, really plan it.
One of the things that was interesting, because as we were talking about actually what brought Peter Jackson onto the film, which was the idea of maybe doing Zoe as CGI and doing the rest live action, they decide to do motion capture. And the way that they filmed this movie is so unique in setting up this, what they call the volume, which is just a room that is not all that large, but it is surrounded by cameras that are capturing everything on the suits. And then they have all these wireframe sets and props that the actors are actually able to pick up and use and have, contact with. And they film the whole movie this way. And like, when you're watching it, it looks kind of insane. But it's so the way they translate that into the animation is phenomenal. I feel like I can't imagine this honestly is live action, because they would have had to like put, prosthetics on people to give them that Hergé look. But this was just, I felt like the perfect way to make the movie so that it felt realistic in some ways, but it also felt like the source material all at the same time.
Yeah. Again, I totally agree. I think they used a lot of the tools that they had developed at the time for Avatar, which was shot over there in New Zealand in that volume at Weta. And this is a technology that Cameron and Peter Jackson and George had really pushed for very hard. I remember we're talking about like the height of the Clone Wars. And I remember George actually, when we were cutting, telling us a lot about him meeting with these other directors and pushing to get that technology out and looking for projects. George was looking for ways to have the Clone Wars use the same technology. He,
Oh, wow.
For quite a while, he was pushing for a volume to be created at ILM, which would allow Dave and the episodic directors to come in and actually shoot physically.
Oh, goodness.
With
That's
actor
awesome.
the episodes. But then that would have been translated directly into a digital set. And yeah, I think, again, of course, and that's a total personal bias, which I'm self-aware of. Having grown up with the books themselves, my instinct is always going to be, I want to see this in 2D land, in a way that emulates Hergé style. A little bit like the opening credits, which I think are also a way to give a nod to the original style of the books. But like I was saying, for the choice that they made in terms of the stories and the grafting of stories, if you say, okay, well, we make the choice that we're going to go 3D with this in any kind of way, anything other than just a 2D and old school animation, they made the right choice. I think live action would have been wrong for the reasons you talked about. Live action combined with CG would have been wrong, because if you shot real backgrounds, you would have needed to light the characters with completely photorealistic lighting, and with these stylized characters, I think it would have looked just bizarre and freakish. And in this case, you get backgrounds that are photorealistic, but they're still CG. And again, even though they look photorealistic, the brain, in the back of your mind, you'll know that they're not real. And so that helps you dial down when you put your characters in there. The fact that the characters are so stylized is not going to make them look freaky, because somewhere in the back of your mind, that the whole thing is fake. So I think they did the right choice. They made the right choice.
Well, I love too, that as they're filming, Jackson was on the set for the first week, and then he had to go back to New Zealand because he's working on King Kong. But he was there every day that they were filming on the video conference with Spielberg, and they would talk back and forth and really working in tandem with each other to make sure that they got their vision out there. And I thought that was like it's totally a Spielberg movie, but to be a director and allow somebody else to help you craft that vision, I think there's a lot of humility for Spielberg in that, and relying on Jackson to help give him pointers or tips or allow him to have an opinion like that. I think I was really blown away by watching the extras and watching these two men work together so well. And they're both master filmmakers. I mean, they've made incredible movies. But the fact that they could it almost seemed like they were able to put those egos aside and just geek out together making this. I thought that was it was kind of really cool to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, this is kind of where we draw back on the universal appeal of the character, and the fact that it's this thing that is so big, and the love that it generates is so big that it then transcends all these other things in terms of ego. And then, like you said, it's just two fans who are geeking out and saying, "Hey, let's do this." And I really loved the way that Jackson took over directing the flashback sequences with Haddock's ancestor. I think it's a great choice. And again, you see there the reflection that goes into the choices they make and the talent, because they're not just randomly saying, "Hey, you direct the first half of the movie and I'll direct the second half," or here's direct part of my sequence or whatever. It's Peter Jackson has a very, very specific style of directing. And if you look at the narrative, these scenes lend themselves very much to that style, because all of a sudden now we're in the past and we're telling a fantastic tale. And so now that right away you're in this world where you almost want to have these big Peter Jackson camera moves, these sweeping vistas, because we're informing the audience again visually. This isn't just something that's happening like the rest of the story. This is now a tale being told, a legend, something epic, right? And so you bring in Peter Jackson and his Lord of the Rings big camera moves, and all of a sudden you have this amazing pirate action, sequence, and sweeping cameras and the masts falling, and and just like Lord of the Rings, you're like, holy crap, what the heck is happening? And you love every second of it. But you see how they're completely, like you said, geeking out, I think, and enjoying themselves, but there's still that calculation of thinking about making the right choices in the right places.
I wanted to ask you what you thought of Spielberg's kind of sensibilities for the movie and how they ended up working for you, especially somebody who is such a big fan.
It's about as perfect as it can be. I mean, I think, again, it's this synergy, right? This magical synergy. Raiders, Indiana Jones is, you could say, subconsciously inspired by things like Tintin. Indirectly, I'm sure you could establish a chain of events that kind of leads Tintin to inspire Indiana Jones. And then in turn, the sensitivities that inform Spielberg, because he's still at a formative stage of his career when he does Indiana Jones. And so films like Indiana Jones and E.T. and Jaws are the films that really built Spielberg's sense of aesthetic and storytelling as a filmmaker, right? So it's funny that you have this kind of full circle. Something like Tintin leads over a course of 30, 40 years to inspire something like Indiana Jones. And then the sense of aesthetic and storytelling that comes from Indiana Jones serves another 30 plus years later to inform the best possible type of storytelling for an animated Tintin story, for a visual Tintin film. I mean, the scene, to stick with this, Spielberg part of the direction, the scene when he and Haddock fly through the storm, and the plane crash lands in the desert, and the whole beat with the propeller at the head, and solving one crisis leads to another crisis. I mean, this is straight out of Indiana Jones, and it works. It's like a glove that fits another glove. It works perfectly for Tintin and Haddock.
Yeah, I was thinking of the scene, the chase scene that they have, and how Indiana Jones that is, and even the part where Tintin ends up off the bike with only the handlebars and sliding down the laundry line and everything. Like, it's so Spielberg, it's so Indiana Jones-ish, but it fits perfectly with everything that you would expect, after reading up a little bit on Tintin, that kind of adventure and craziness, and if Hergé had been able to do something in 3D, you get the feeling like this would be the kind of thing he would have loved to have had access to being able to do with the character. And it just, I think Spielberg and Jackson together, they kind of have the perfect aesthetic and sentimental sensibilities when working with this kind of property that make this movie just a joy to watch from beginning to the end. So I really, this was a movie where I felt like all of the things that sometimes we can ding Spielberg for really come out to play perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when Steven Spielberg allows himself to be a kid again, is when he's going to create pure magic. Sometimes I feel like when Steven Spielberg tries too hard to be a grown-up and to be self-aware of himself as an adult and give his material gravitas and make sure that it can be something that's, I think, as perceived by him, taken seriously. It's not that he's not creating then good stuff, but he loses a little bit touch with that pure part of what I perceive to be his creative heart. And then it's not going to be as genuine. It might still be great. It might still be amazing, beautifully shot, beautifully directed, beautifully edited, but it's not going to be as genuine as when Spielberg allows himself to view the project that he's working on through the prism of that 12-year-old's eyes. And I feel like, even though, again, ironically, he didn't know Tintin when he was 12 years old, you see that connection, that direct or indirect connection between that and the things that did inform him, in the sense that you feel like everything that inspires Spielberg and that he loves all of a sudden comes to life again. And you feel like you are watching Spielberg in 1976 or 1980, 1981, just having fun and expressing himself, really expressing his voice.
No, I do. I completely agree with you. One of the things I wanted to ask, because we had talked about it a little bit before, them melding the different plots together. I wanted to ask you specifically about the plot and how you felt like it worked here for the movie as an introduction for basically really American audiences, but even around the world. And for somebody who's a fan, how this plot of Tintin finding this ship and it connecting with Haddock and, of course, in the end, Red Rackham and the pirates and all that stuff, how you felt like all this works together.
I think it works great. I mean, I think that I can look at it from both angles. There are things that I don't regret, but as a fan of the books, that I wish were different, because Tintin and the Crab Golden Pincers is the story that actually introduces Haddock, and it has this element, the scene with the boat where he first meets Haddock, who's been kind of held captive by his own crew, and all that part, and they escape and they fly this plane to over the ocean to this desert. All that is from that book. That book in itself is much more straightforward. Tintin is trying to bust a cartel of drug dealers who smuggle opium into Europe. And I do like, if I look at it straight up from the angle of the books, I like the fact that it's a great way to introduce the characters with a simple story, so that you don't have the story overpower the characters and the setups. But it would also, at the stakes that we're talking about for the movie, it probably wouldn't be enough of a story for the first Tintin animated movie.
I mean, nothing like going to a kid's movie and having it deal with a
drug cartel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, the two other books, which are Red Rackham and The Secret of the Unicorn, the things that I'm missing there, these came along much further into the life of the Tintin books. And so at that point, everyone already knows the principal actors the settings, so you're able to jump into the adventure, and you're able to then you have room for a lot more epic scenery. I mean, there's this whole thing where they have this awesome submarine which looks like a shark, and Tintin goes underwater in the sub, and there's this whole thing where he actually finds the unicorn underwater. There's a lot more that's really big and epic, and the opportunity for these great set pieces. But that's the opposite issue of the first one, because you already know everyone. It's these big set pieces, but there's not a lot of character development or character introduction. You already know everyone. And I think that if you had just focused on that, you might have been able to make a much bigger, much more epic even movie. But at the same time, people would have probably been left scratching their heads saying, I'm confused. I don't really know who these people are. And so again, like I can look at it and say, oh man, I just wish, but needing to stitch things together to have the sense of epic and adventure, but at the same time, let you know who are the principal players and what's going on, what's at stake. They did a phenomenal job. They just, made the right choices.
What did you end up thinking about the casting for some of the main characters like Tintin and Haddock and Sakharine and, of course, Thompson and Thompson?
Yeah, my two favorites, I have to say, I think everyone was great. My two favorites are Daniel Craig and Andy Serkis. And again, I'm just speculating, but listening to Craig do Sakharine, you can almost palpably hear him having fun.
Yeah,
it feels completely like one of those cases where an actor who gets to play a villain, which is oftentimes they'll say a lot more fun because you can go over the top. B, you tell him, and guess what? You can do it from a booth where you can just go crazy. You don't have to be careful of how the camera's looking at you, and it's your voice that's going to drive, right? And I feel like you can really, it's so different, and it comes out as this great over the top Tintin villain. And Andy Serkis, I'm one of those. Andy Serkis tends to polarize people. People either love him or they can't stand him. I'm not sure why, but I think he's phenomenal. So pretty much everything I see him in, whether it's himself or he's doing a digital performance, I think he's great, and he nailed Haddock. I mean, Haddock is within a universe where the characters are all cartoony in their design, and again, in the way they're drawn, and some of the kinetic energy, poses, and so on. Haddock is the cartoon within a cartoony universe. I mean, he's the one who, even when the scene, what's happening, the story beat is kind of more grounded, he's going to bring the comic relief at a moment of tension or otherwise, fear. And so as a little kid, Haddock, I don't know if I would say he was my favorite. I think Tintin was my favorite, but I loved Haddock because he was the one that always made me laugh, right? And I thought that Serkis really nailed the voice. If I had to imagine a voice for Haddock, it would be that voice in French, and the mannerisms, everything was just great. Yeah,
nothing like a French Scotsman. So.
Yeah, I mean, I did, and it's funny. I've been meaning to do it for a while, but I only got around to it. I think it was last year. I finally watched the movie in French, which was great. Yeah, I had a great time.
I have to say, I feel like the casting was just perfect. Jamie Bell is Tintin is wonderful. He has such a vitality to him. He has that kind of ageless, timeless quality to him. As he ages, he still feels young, and so that's perfect for Tintin. I love Andy Serkis. I think he's a genius, and what he's done for film with motion capture and making that something that I think should be respected and is just another way of giving a performance, needs to be recognized. And so Really, really like the way he plays Haddock, and Haddock is, like you said, he's just such a fun character to watch visually. And part of that is because Andy Serkis knows how to use his body in every single possible way to make something bigger than life on screen. And so I love that. And yeah, I think you're right on target with Daniel Craig. He is such an interesting choice to be in a kid's movie, but he's so good as this villain. And I think you're absolutely right. He tends I feel like he's just enjoying hamming it up for one of the few times in his career. Like, he doesn't really get to do that all that much. So, and then, I mean, Nick Frost and Simon Pegg as Thompson and Thompson. I don't know what could be better casting than those two.
I mean, yeah, it's they're it's like the Cheech and Chong kind of their time. They're like one does not go without the other, right? So just like Thompson and Thompson.
One of the few things that I kind of felt like thematically that I really enjoyed was this was the whole idea of Haddock, having this curse, right? This Haddock curse, and it allows him to kind of blame everything that goes wrong on this curse instead of really kind of working hard. But at the same time, he's kind of just living up to everybody's expectations of what they have of him. And so he just kind of wallows in defeat. And I loved the way in which his relationship with Tintin kind of slowly starts to bring him out of that. And I thought that was, like, that's a cool thing about this movie. You have this character who's really, with Haddock, he's very flawed. And, I mean, he's an alcoholic, and all these kind of things, not something you generally get in a kid's movie, but the kind of the slow redemption of this character through his relationship with somebody who doesn't know him from Adam and doesn't see that he has to be that way and kind of challenges him to be better, I thought was really cool to have in the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially if you think about it in context of you want to have this be an origin story, and which then means you want to do more and you want to keep telling these characters' story. I think it's a great way to set it up because in the universe of Tintin, once they meet, Tintin and Haddock are inseparable.
Yeah,
they are literally inseparable. And not only that, but Haddock, he has his own character arc and improves over time in the books, but he remains very flawed. He's prone to be very opinionated, to have a temper and so on and so forth. But when it comes to Tintin, he won't hesitate. Whatever, if there's a place where he won't go, he'll go if he knows that Tintin's in danger. If there's a thing he wouldn't do, he'll do it without hesitating if he knows that it'll help Tintin, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that what you do by doing what you were describing is you lay down the ground for why this guy, once they've gone through what they go through in the first adventure, would look at Tintin and go, okay, well, that's the guy who basically I owe having gotten my life back and my past, everything, having redeemed myself. So you set them up to be the perfect partners for the next adventure.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I just love, when they finally get to that whole, he draws out of, it seems to come out of nowhere, but it's because of his relationship with Tintin, where he remembers that old Haddock proverb of, if you hit a wall, you push through it. And that's kind of what he ends up doing with his life in general, is kind of pushing through some of his, darker proclivities, for alcohol and that kind of stuff. And I think that is kind of a neat thing for, if you're a parent and you're showing this kid to your kids, I think that's one of those cool things that, you can talk about, that whole process of learning to be a better person, and that really comes through relationship, with each other. So, I think that's really neat. The last thing I wanted to talk to you before we rate this is, Williams' soundtrack here, I honestly think this is one that people don't even know Williams did for the most part, because a lot of people may not have seen this movie, but I think it's really underrated.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the best way I can talk about the soundtrack is I remember I have a close friend of mine who's a huge fan of early Spielberg era, and in particular Indiana Jones, Raiders, Temple of Doom, um, Last Crusade, and he loves everything about that 1981 through 1989 period, including John Williams. And I remember him telling me that he had gone to see Tintin, I think with some family member, not knowing. I think he knew Spielberg had directed it, but not knowing anything about it. And I remember him texting me like crazy when he walked out, saying, "Oh my God, and the soundtrack, I felt like
Yeah.
it was like all the best of Indiana Jones. I was listening, it really sold me on that energy, and these moments that I love, and this kind of hijinks adventure. And I think Williams captures it perfectly. I mean, you do hear this is Williams, this is later older John Williams, and he's more subdued than he was at that time. But I think he does a great job of capturing the kind of the hijinks, adventure, these also a little bit of these colorful, exotic themes that you had, especially in old serials when you would go to another faraway country. And he also, there's a little bit of you hear sometimes kind of like a little bit of a 1950s kind of these light-hearted adventure comedies, with movies like with stars like Cary Grant and so on, that kind of had this sort of jazzy, light-hearted music that was made the music was kind of telling you, yes, this is high energy and there's adventure and action, but you're never supposed to really be tense or afraid. You're supposed to enjoy yourself. And I think that was a conscious choice here, because they're dealing, it's a challenge in the US to release an animated film, which is supposed to read like legitimate drama or adventure and so on. But at the same time, if it's animated, everyone is going to assume I should be able to take my kids. It doesn't matter how much you disclaim it. It has to have the right elements so people don't feel like it's not a kid's movie, or else they're not going to embrace an animated film. And I think that there's a lot of elements. Again, you can see the deliberate choice, including in the music, to have these tones that tell you, okay, yes, it's high energy and it's intense, but at the same time, it's still lighthearted. You're supposed to have fun. You're supposed to kind of stroll through it and not be pushed or terrified about what's going to turn around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love when Williams does jazz in his soundtrack. It kind of reminded me a little bit of 101 Dalmatians. That Disney soundtrack is all jazz, which I love. So it had some of that feel to it, and then it just kind of feels like the amalgamation of a gumshoe noir detective adventure story. And you just kind of threw all those things together, and you get this super fun, wonderful, playful soundtrack that's just so enjoyable. And it, like, there's such life to it. And yeah, you can hear some of the things that Williams has kind of used in other places, but I don't feel like that detracts in any way. I actually feel like a lot of the times when you hear some of those motifs that he's used, like maybe in an Indiana Jones or something like that, it actually accentuates the joy of this movie by kind of helping you just almost relive that. So I feel like it's just something that's really well done, and it's one that I regularly will listen to, just because it has a playfulness, and it kind of puts you in a good mood listening to. So yeah, that's one of the things I really love about it.
Yeah, I think that goes to the point I was making, where it always, it's intense at times and it's mysterious at times and it's a little spooky at times, but there's always something that makes you feel like it's lighthearted and it's not to be taken too seriously in a good way, where it tells
Yeah.
you, you're supposed to be, you're still here no matter what's going to happen, you're going to have fun. And the opening theme, the main theme, has this very kind of Michel Legrand or Henry Mancini, a little bit like the Pink
Mm-hmm.
Panther kind of feel to it. Um, so there's like combinations of jazz, and then there's moments where, yeah, it definitely dips into indie territory. But I think, like you were saying, I never feel like it's derivative. I feel like it's almost like Stranger Things, where you watch Stranger Things and that it's inspired by this or inspired by that, but it feels appropriate and it feels like you said that this is motivated. It's the essence of that is captured to evoke a feeling, and so here it feels like it's motivated and similarly like it's chosen deliberately to capture the essence of a moment, whether it's adventure or comedy and so on and so forth.
I definitely feel that it doesn't feel like it's copying. It just feels like a wonderful homage to what, him and Spielberg have done before, which in a lot of ways, Tintin is an homage to everything that they have done, which is so much fun because it is the Spielberg movie that, if your kids aren't old enough for indie yet, you can show them this, right? And you can enjoy the feelings that you have as a kid with indie, and then kind of ready them to enjoy indie when maybe they're a little bit older, because it's not necessarily something you want to show to a 5-year-old, right? But you'd be more comfortable with showing this to a 5-year-old. So,
Mm-hmm.
in the end, Nick, gosh, if you were going to put a rating on The Adventures of Tintin, what do you think?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I would give it hovering between 8 and 8.5. I would give it. I think I'd give it an 8.5. An 8.5 Thompson. That's Thompson with a P, not Thompson with.
Oh, yes. Perfect. Gosh, I think on Letterboxd I have this at 4 out of 5 stars, and I think that's about an 8 out of 10 as a rating. And so I
Yeah.
think I'm just right there with you. This is 8 out of 10 stolen wallets.
Nice.
It really is a joy of a movie. I remember showing it to my wife, and she really had a good time with it. She is a huge animal person, so she thought Snowy was adorable. This is a fun movie. In fact, this is the first movie that had won a Golden Globe for Best Animated Feature that was a non-Pixar film at this point. And so that lets you, I think, know that this is quality stuff, and I'm surprised more people didn't enjoy it and see it, but if you haven't seen it and you're listening to this episode, I highly encourage you to do so. Honestly, Nick, I just hope that they'll go ahead and make another one of these, because I really want to see Peter Jackson fully with the reins of direction in that next one, because that's their plan.
Absolutely, and I mean I had read at the time Peter Jackson had said that the next one he was going to do was at Temple of the Sun, which makes total sense, because it's one of the best Tintin adventures. It's a two-parter as well, so they have definitely a lot of material to make it into a feature, and that's even more straight up, which is the irony keeps on building. If you read those two books, it really feels like an Indiana Jones story, complete with, you start in Europe and then you travel to the jungles of South America and you find the secret temple, and there's a lot of really great stuff. And to see what Peter Jackson would do with that, it would be. I keep, every now and then I'll hear like a secret rumor and this and that, but I don't think it's anything is happening right now. And I grow a little worried that because now it's been so long, it's been I think 6 or 7 years since the film came out, that just by sheer inertia they're going to kind of grow out of it, and they're all really busy doing other stuff. Jason McGatlin is here producing the Star Wars movie. Spielberg is doing a ton of stuff, including soon a new Indiana Jones movie. Peter Jackson, I'm not sure. The only kind of thing that sort of keeps my hope up is that I'm not hearing Peter Jackson working on anything else. So I tell myself, well, maybe there's hope.
Well, it just seems like a good movie for him to do anyway, because, it doesn't take that long for them to film in the void. It really doesn't. I think the schedule that they had here it took like 30 days. It's really quick. And then you just get to, sit back and enjoy the process of putting the rest of it together digitally, which Jackson loves doing anyway. So if you're listening, Peter Jackson, which we hope you are, you please get on that with the new Tintin movie. But want to say a huge thank you to our associate producers through Patreon, Ken Tripp and Davis Grayson, been supporting the show through Patreon and the network for a very long time, and great guys, and they know something that's really important. Trek FM is a huge network, and we have so much happening, and there's no way that we can make this happen on our own. And Patreon is the best way for you to be able to support the network and make sure that all the shows that we have keep coming to each and every week. But, as you'll notice, there's no ads. So you just get great content that you love listening to without having to listen to somebody stop and tell you about whatever. So that all happens because of listeners just like you. So go over to patreon.com/TrekFM. You can see how you can be part of our team. Honestly, every little bit helps a month. And so there's many different ways that we love giving back to you, whether it's the Patreon Roundtable that we do, or exclusive content, early access to content, all that kind of stuff. So again, it's patreon.com/TrekFM. Now, Nick, I love having you here on the 602 Club. I love that this is the show that brought us together and gave us the opportunity to become friends. But if anybody would like to talk to you about Tintin or anything else, where could people find you to be able to do that?
The two best places are either on Facebook, where I'm not there too often, but I do go on Facebook regularly, and just you can look for my name, Nic Anastassiou, or on the Babel Conference, which is Trek FM's private listener group. And I'm on the Babel Conference quite often. So you can, there's any number of threads, usually a lot of the 602 Club ones that I'll join in and pipe in with my two-bit comments. So you can find me there.
Awesome, man. You can find me, of course, all over the place. I'm on Twitter, MattRushing02, and on Instagram under the same name. I'm here on the network with Chris Jones talking about Deep Space Nine, The Orb. We hope to be back very soon, so make sure that you're looking for those episodes that Chris and I are crossing our fingers. We're actually going to get the opportunity to drop a new episode soon, so I hope you'll enjoy that. You could find me on the Nerd Party Network with, as we talked about, Nick and I, John Mills. We're doing Aggressive Negotiations, talking about all things Star Wars. We have a blast doing it. We just recently did our episode on Rogue One. We did a commentary of that. We asked the funny question on are there theme parks in Star Wars? And if there are, what are they like? So check that out. You can also find me doing Owlpost with Drea Kaufman as we talk about each and every chapter of the Harry Potter series, one by one. It's a blast. We're right in the middle of The Prisoner of Azkaban. And then last but not least, I'm doing a show called Cinema Stories with my good friend Courtney. And we just talk about film through the lens of faith. And you can find all of those on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. But thank y'all so much for joining us, and y'all come back now, you hear?